if anybody wants to actually speak as opposed to type for questions, feel free at any stage during the process, all right? One of the things I'm actually going to do is challenge some of the obsession with digital communication, in terms of human cognitive capacity, right? Just to give you a bit of a background, actually was the school I was at in Wales had one of the first ever school computers, but it was on a 200 baud modem line to the local technical college. I wrote my first computer program to fake my physics practical results because it was really boring doing the practicals and you knew what result you had to get anyway. And we sold the program for 5 guineas to the first year 6 when we left. And we made, that was a lot of money back in the 60s, right? No, early 70s at that point. Either way, I spent a lot of my time building decision support systems for people like Guinness Group, Vesti Group and the like. And also did some of the first stuff on inventory management and logistics software. That was my sort of software background and then my business management background. And then I ended up as strategy director of a company called Data Sciences, which got taken over by IBM. And IBM was the best of times and worst of times. They let me do what the hell I wanted without supervision for 7 years until finally I failed several tests of obedience in a very short time scale and sort of had to leave, right? But that was an entertaining period, and I'll tell you some stories about that as we go through. So the thing we've been developing, I've just set up a new thing called the Cynefin Centre. That's a picture of its physical location. A building called Pontio at Bangor University in North Wales. This is me going home. I grew up in North Wales. The mountains are just, I can actually, in 20 minutes, I can be climbing a 3,000-foot mountain from the office. This is good news, all right, as far as I'm concerned. And we're about to build a new software team there as well to do some new developments. Right? Basically, what we've done is we've moved the non-commercial part of Cognitive Edge, the research and development, the government work, the NGO work, into that centre. And one of the things I'll talk about towards the end, we're about to launch 3 major participative programs for the IT industry. These are ones where multiple companies and multiple consultancies can join and collaboratively create standards. One of the things I particularly dislike about Agile is small companies creating proprietary methods and focusing on accreditation and pyramid selling schemes rather than actually developing software. In fact, it seems to be the entire revenue base of Agile is based on accreditation and training, not delivering software at the moment, right? And I got into this interesting when I spoke at an XP conference, and I'll say something which will make me popular with some and unpopular with others. I think I've got a huge amount of time for Scrum, but I think it's a pity Agile didn't define itself more around XP. Then I think it would have been more resilient. The trouble is most of the people I know in XP can't talk with anybody who isn't another XP person. So that probably explains why it didn't happen, right? But I'll build on that as we go through. Anyway, I run 3 programs. One is a radical new approach to project management. We're working here with Prince 2, with the actual community, Prince 2 Agile. The book contained my Cynefin framework. That got us talking. And basically, over 2 years, with up to, I think we're going to allow 30 companies to be a part of that. The intention is to create a new model and tools for project management which legitimizes waterfall, legitimizes Scrum, legitimizes time boxes, and legitimizes what we're calling pre-Scrum techniques within Agile. Yeah? And from my point of view, that's really important. That needs to be done as an international standard, not as a proprietary instrument. Right? So that's one program. Another program on software testing I'll reference a few times in terms of how we actually, a lot of stuff around software testing and what are called anticipatory alerts. This comes from the work we did on counterterrorism, which is where most of this stuff came from in DARPA, which is how do you trigger human beings to a heightened state of alert when things might be going wrong, rather than how do you detect that things are going wrong. Yeah, and that's actually a sort of what's called a dispositional type approach, and I'll explain that again. And then the final one, which I'm going to spend a bit of time on today, is a new approach to user requirements capture. I have a personal belief that the sooner we get rid of systems analysts, the sooner we'll actually deliver better software. Which is actually working on continuous capture of user needs and in the unarticulated needs which IT could actually satisfy. So not waiting for users to know they want something, but find a method by which we can start to deploy IT in a more co-evolutionary approach. And I'll go through those, and those will be on the website shortly as participation programs. Yeah? Now the big thing I developed and this started, well, really probably before IBM, but really within IBM, so this is about 20 years old now, is to say that social science, and by implication management science, and by implication all of the organizational development community, organizational change community, are kind of like in a bad place. My first degree is a joint honours in physics and philosophy, theoretical physics and philosophy. My father was a veterinary surgeon, yeah. After spending my teenage years having to do sheath washings on bulls on freezing cold February mornings, I decided my future lay in philosophy and theoretical physics. All right? That was a very clear decision quite early on in my career. Right? But both of those disciplines taught me to have a contempt for social science. Yeah? Because social science, my implication management science, is stuck in either acceptance or rejection of a model of science which is actually at least a century old. Yeah, it's a sort of deterministic linear type model. Yeah? So what I started to do was to say, what can we learn from the natural sciences and how can we apply that to social systems? That gives us a much higher degree of resilience because you can say, well, we know this is true about human cognition and we know these things are not true. Therefore, if you actually have a method which assumes that these things are true, it's going to fail. Yeah, that's the sort of basic principle of this approach. Yeah? It also handles higher levels of uncertainty. And one of the problems we've got is the case-based approach doesn't work under conditions of uncertainty. And you all know the case-based approach. Somebody goes and studies 10 or 15 cases. Let's take, I forgot the name of the book, the one which has a Jade organization in it, Le Crux, Reinventing the Organization or something. Anybody remember that? What was it called? It came out recently, everybody's into it. It's got this report on holacracy, which kind of like implies it's working, as opposed to the fact we all know it's failing. Right? Either way, it's one of a popular genre of management books in that somebody has a hypothesis. They go and find cases which support the hypothesis and write a book about it, and then sell a method. And another one is Lean Startup, if anybody's read that. And so he goes and studies a whole group of companies who have been successful and identifies things they do and then creates a recipe that you should follow. I've decided I'm going to do 3 pivots in one next year because I know if I do 3 pivots then I'll be successful. I mean, the book tells me so. And I remember once asking a question. I said, well, did you study companies who'd failed? And he said, no. And I said, well, we actually did in the Institute for Knowledge Management and IBM, and we discovered companies who failed in startup did all the same things that companies who succeeded did. It's just you've got so many of the buggers that some of them are bound to succeed anyway, all right? And you're imputing causality in a way which doesn't exist. Yeah? And scientific method is very simple. You observe physical data, you construct a hypothesis, and the idea is you then go and test if your hypothesis works in a different context. And most of the writers of management science books have kind of like forgotten that stage. Once they've got the hypothesis and the cases, that's all they want. Yeah? So 3 major problems we have with case-based theory. One is called the Cobra Effect. This is from the English in India. When the Welsh use English and when we use British is significant, all right? We're very precise in our use of language here. So the English decided there were too many cobras in India, something which, having had 3 close encounters, I agree with, far too many of the buggers. So they announced a reward for 1 rupee for every cobra head brought into the district commissioner. That actually produced a really good effect. Lots of people killed cobras, but then people started to realize there was good money to be had breeding cobras. So cobra farms were formed. And then the British government discovered this, so they got rid of the reward, at which point all the cobras were released into the wild because there was no need for them, and we had more cobras rather than less, all right? And this is problematic, right? You see this when people announce a new initiative. Yeah, I mean, I remember working with Telstra up in Brisbane, and they told me that everything these days had to be agile, and they had waterfall projects, so they were running 1-year sprints. I quite admired them for that. Yeah. What matters wasn't what you did, but how you said that you did it, because you had to conform to what people with power and money wanted you to do, right? And Cobra Effect is a really big danger when you announce initiatives. We're seeing the same things with things like SAFE now. Although fortunately it's collapsing faster than most of us thought it would. And that really is a pyramid selling scheme, right? I'll go into that more if you want at any stage, all right? I have no problem with that one. Right? The second one is butterfly effect. This is a famous cliche. A butterfly flaps its wings in the Amazon rainforest, and it's held to cause a hurricane in Texas. Well, just to be clear, it doesn't, all right? I mean, I know Texans. If butterflies were causing hurricanes in Texas, yeah, by now they'd been subject to vigilante action with extreme prejudice, right? The point is that something very small, uniquely this time, combines with some other small things, which this time produces a hurricane. Yeah? And again, I'll come back to say, if I read some of the literature on, say, if it was based on one or two cases, yeah, run by one or two consultants with a lot of experience, you can't extrapolate a method from a limited number of cases. And I'd also hit something called Hawthorne Effect. Yeah? This is from experiments run in the 20s in the Hawthorne factory up in New York State. So they increased lighting levels and people became more productive. This is the height of scientific management. So they decided they'd double test their assumption. They decreased the lighting levels and people became more productive, and that really wasn't meant to happen. And what they discovered, if you do anything novel with good people and pay attention, people will respond. It doesn't mean it's sustainable. Yeah? So just think about how many methods and tools and accreditation programs are sold when actually the cases on which they based it are basically Cobra effect, Hawthorne effect, or butterfly effect. Yeah? If you don't understand why something worked, you shouldn't try and replicate what worked in those cases. And this is a key principle of what's called naturalizing sense making. Yeah? You have to understand why something works before you can seek to replicate it. Yeah? So what I want to do is just briefly summarize some of the core theory which applies here, and then we'll go from there. The first is a key thing called inattentional blindness. If you're about to have an X-ray, start to worry about this. This has been replicated many times. Now remember, radiologists, all right, are highly trained individuals dealing with a very limited amount of data. Compared with systems analysts who are actually fairly poorly trained individuals dealing with a huge amount of data. So this is a very narrow case. Yeah? You actually ask them to look for cancer nodules within an X-ray. You give them a batch of X-rays. On one of the X-rays, you hide a picture of a gorilla, which is 48 times the size of another cancer nodule, and over 80% don't see it, even though their eyes physically scan it. Now just start to think about the implications of that, right? It's a very limited set with very highly trained individuals, and they do not see what they do not expect to see. Yeah? Now that has major implications. Yeah? Just to give you some more of the science behind it. The most you observe in what is in front of you, if you're on a really good day, if you're really, really focused, is about 4 to 5%. If you're Chinese, it goes up to 9 to 10%. It's a different cognitive development based on the need to understand context associated with pictorial languages. But you know, for most people in this audience, it's kind of like 4 or 5%. That's what you'll scan. Yeah? You then match it against immediately recalled patterns, your own experiences, the vicarious experiences of others that you've picked up through stories. A radiologist has somewhere in the region of 30 or 40,000 patterns stored in their brain, their body, and their tools. It's all three, by the way. Consciousness is a distributed function. It's not co-located with the brain. Yeah? So basically, 30 or 40,000 patterns, the most frequently used ones get activated first. Yeah? So they do a first fit pattern match, not a best fit pattern match. Yeah? That's actually quite scary when you think about it. If they haven't seen a disease group for 10 or 15 years, they physically won't see it. Yeah? I say my father was a vet. He spotted rabies in a dog in Britain one day before it was due to be released from quarantine. Then if rabies came into the country, we had a quarantine structure, then if ever it got out, the policy was to kill every mammal within 1 mile radius of the outbreak. Human beings were exempt for reasons vets never really agreed with, all right, on the basis that it was bad containment facility, but that was the policy. So he saved the country a fortune, right? So he got medals and awards, and 14-year-old kid, dad's done something great. And I remember saying, how did you do it? And he said, well, first of all, I've seen rabies, most vets haven't. He was in the veterinary corps during the war. He served in Afghanistan and Egypt, so kind of like he'd seen it. But he said, I wouldn't have spotted it if I hadn't been telling you the story about the rabid jackal hunt the night before. He said, so it was on my mind. Now, it's actually quite interesting with all the work I've done in DARPA on counter-terrorism. Thwarting terrorist actions has been very similar. Something was on somebody's mind, so they noticed something which wasn't otherwise being seen. And if you look at the congressional report on 9/11, somebody didn't notice the significance of people being trained to fly but not take off and land. Yeah? So you actually, the scary thing about this is you can't make people see everything. So we have to take a very different approach. Yeah? And I'll go through one of the solutions on that. Well, I'll tell you about it now. This is something we're now doing in a whole range of fields. So I was speaking at a conference in Florida. I had a really interesting week. One day was with one of the world's leading fashion chains. I like this client. I'm working on them with Clayton Christensen. It's my favorite client. They stay in hotels that don't have stars because only inferior hotels need stars. The Paris Ballet were commissioned to perform a special ballet for their last senior management team. This is my indulgence of a client, this one. Right? And they went on from that to effectively 2,000 or 3,000 American intelligence agents in a human terrain mapping conference. And the bastards announced that Snowden was keynoting at their conference, but didn't say which Snowden and put me on first, right? Which kind of like maxed out attendance, and I was slightly nervous going on. I might actually have a handbook at home from the University of Texas telling me that I mustn't provoke my students next year because they're going to be allowed open carry on campus. So I'm probably not going to go, right? But either way, so you get the picture. So what we did there, because we know about this problem, is we presented the situation on Syria as a mixture of a picture and text on a screen. We got everybody to interpret it into what's called high abstraction metadata, which I'll explain later. Human interpretation, not machine interpretation. And we drew a fitness landscape which showed the dominant and the minority views, and that took 60 seconds from start to finish. Which actually meant we could see the 5 or 10% who were seeing the world differently from everybody else, and people's attention was drawn to that. Now, you'll now see a principle of naturalizing sense making. Live with things as they are, rather than trying to train people to be something other than they evolved to be, but build processes which actually work with the way people are, again, not the way you think they should be. Yeah? That's something we're now starting to deploy for whole of workforce engagement. Yeah? So the ability to ask a question of every single member of the workforce in real time is decision support, what we call real-time distributed decision support. Yeah? It's also the way, one of the ways, by the way, you start to actually look at user needs is you move into fast real-time feedback loops rather than linear processes of capture and interpretation. Yeah? So that's kind of like one principle, one application for that. The other one is the whole issue about complexity, and I'm not going to do the Cynefin framework now. I haven't really got time to do that, but you can look at that. There's plenty of material. The key thing is to understand that there are 3 different types of system which exist: ordered systems, chaotic systems, and complex systems. Now, just to be clear, there is as yet no consensus on language here. So some people will use chaos where I would use complex. Yeah? And that's what happens in a new field. It doesn't mean that people are right or wrong. It just means they come from different disciplines. Right? Now, where I'm coming from, which is a mixture of mathematics, physics, philosophy, this is kind of like the normal distinction. So an ordered system has a very high degree of constraint. Constraints come in 2 types: containing constraints and coupling constraints. Yeah? So a container is something which surrounds things, and the boundary is defined. Yeah, and it can be hard or it can be permeable or whatever. And then coupling constraints, whatever is the unit of analysis, it's the links between those units. Yeah? So if I have a system which has a rigid container and everything is tightly coupled both to itself and to the container, that's called an ordered system. Yeah, because I've got a very high degree of constraint, I've got predictability and repeatability. Yeah, my favorite example of that is operating theatres, where we count the number of surgical instruments left at the end of an operation and check it's the same as was there at the start. Yeah, this is of increasing importance to my life as I grow older. Right? I expect to have to, to be the beneficiary of this at some stage, hopefully not for long. My wife just has been. She's in hospital after a fairly major operation, but she came through before I left. And I'm glad they got those procedures, because I know the percentage of surgical instruments left in people's body before they instituted it. And it's a scarily high figure. Yeah? The trouble is we get seduced by cases. So people saw this phenomenon and said, isn't this wonderful? So they put checklists everywhere. And they didn't understand the context in which it works. And in an operating theatre, what actually happens is, how many people have been in an operating theatre vertically, not horizontally? Okay, I've been in horizontally once and vertically twice, all right? Both my children were, to quote Shakespeare, from their mother's womb untimely ripped, right? And certainly I will say from a husband's point of view, a Cesarean operation is a wonderful thing. It's a fascinating operation to watch. And you get to see and hold your child first, and you get 2 weeks more at home without crying babies. So I'm all in favour of them, all right? But my wife has a different view on this. All right? But the process of scrubbing up to go in is actually a ritual act. And what ritual does is something called cognitive activation. It activates the brain so that actually a certain pattern of response is possible. So what actually happens is when the doctor scrubs up, their identity aligns with their role for a limited period of time. It's what happens in crews. So checklists are possible. If you don't have a ritual alignment of identity with role, checklists aren't sustainable. And they actually break down and they create false promise. In fact, people tick the boxes and say, we've done all this, haven't we, lads? And they don't actually go through the process. And that actual ritual is actually quite important in terms of cognitive activation. We've done a lot of work in health and safety in which we've radically improved safety by literally getting, for example, truck drivers to strap on heated belts the minute they get out of the lorry before they unload it. Because otherwise they've been driving for 200 or 300 miles, their brains are activated around driving. It takes 10 or 15 minutes for everything to reset. By making it a ritual act, we do an immediate reset. When you actually drive your car next, you'll find there's certain little routines you go through. Yet they're rituals which are creating cognitive activation patterns which make you a safer driver. We're about to start experiments in Berlin of getting developers to change their clothes before they test their software. Because actually you're pattern trained as a developer to believe that you wrote the right code. And we actually think by actually triggering a cognitive activation change, we might make a difference. Now that's an interesting set of experiments, but you can see where this stuff comes from. Oh, and by the way, the reason we are pattern trained in that way, you might think it would be more convenient if we scanned everything and made logical decisions. Well, think about the early hominoids on the savannas of Africa. Something large and yellow with very sharp teeth runs towards you at high speed. Do you want to autistically scan all available data, look up a catalogue of the flora and fauna of the African veldt, and having identified lion, look at best practice case studies on how to deal with lions? By that time, the only document of any use to you will be the book of Jonah from the Old Testament, which is the only example I know of how to escape from the digestive tract of a large carnivore. Right? So we learn to make decisions very, very quickly. Right? And that's important to realize. So order has value, but it's difficult to sustain. It takes a huge amount of energy to create an ordered system because of the energy required for the constraints. And I say when it breaks down, it can break down catastrophically. It's quite, the company I worked for was taken over by IBM. The first thing they did was to actually charge us for coffee. And the second thing they did was to ban alcohol. I had to smuggle lots of whiskey out of the office. Right? Now, as far as I'm concerned, this is a totally uncivilized decision. The coffee alcohol cycle is critical to good software development. Right? Nobody should be expected to talk to a user without alcohol. Right? You then have to have coffee to sober up to write the code, and then you really need the alcohol because users never want what they asked for. When you give it to them, they want something else, and you need to have something to calm you down before you go through the process. So the cycle was important, but they banned it, so we kind of worked around that. We just held meetings in pubs off-site, which would actually give us an invoice for food and accommodation, and wouldn't mention the almanac and the beer, and that was a way around it. Then it got really nasty. They said we couldn't buy food for staff. Now, by this time, we'd learned the only way you deal with bureaucrats is to actually approach it Socratically. If you know about Socratic Technique. If you don't, it's a really valuable tool of rhetoric. You never argue something. You ask somebody else questions so they contradict themselves. Hillary Clinton did quite well on this the other day with variations on it, but it was an easy target, to be honest. Right? So this is your only possibility with bureaucrats, all right? Arguing from the point of view of rational approaches to customer or user need or business need, that won't work, all right? Corporate HR departments did not get to the state they are today by listening to logical, rational arguments, all right? It's not the way they work. So we actually said, well, look, what happens at 3 o'clock in the morning? We think this is a great policy. We really appreciate it. We would never have thought of banning food for our staff. This is one of the major benefits of joining IBM. And at this point, we realize they don't understand irony, and it becomes a deadly weapon. We can switch on and off with HTML code in parallel chat lines, all right? And we say, what happens at 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, where the only thing I can do to keep my teams awake, you know, I'm the general manager, for God's sake, I'm sea level. I'm not allowed to buy pizza and Coke. I didn't quite say it like that. I said, the only thing we can do is buy pizza and Coke. What are we meant to do? And they actually looked quite worried, and they started to whisper and talk to each other, and I realized they may have got it wrong. I said, we do mean the drink. I just want to be clear on that. I don't want any ambiguity about, you know, hard drugs or anything. Yeah? And they relaxed, and they said, well, what do you think we should do? And we said, well, it's your policy. I mean, we would never have thought of it, but we assume you've thought this through. And you could see them, yeah, that was fun, all right? They were squirming. But they weren't stupid, right? They said, well, you know, vice presidential approval 48 hours before the event. So he said, God, that's genius, all right? We would never have thought of it. Yeah? On the very rare occasions where we don't get 48 hours notice of a crisis, and they're listening to us seriously, so now we know sarcasm can be used as well as irony, all right? And you know, they don't understand either, and even if they did, they wouldn't understand the difference, right? You know, what do we do then? Yeah. And they said, oh, country general manager approval after the event, which is a way of saying yes, but actually saying no, because you now know your expenses will disappear into the South Bank office. Nobody will sign them. If you complain about it, your name will start to appear on the wrong sorts of lists, all right? And you don't want to be on those lists, all right? They're bad places to be. So friends of mine, I hasten to add, I would never do anything like this. I only heard about this on the rumour mill. Got into the habit of over-tipping London taxi drivers, which meant they got blank receipts. The blank receipts were then filled out to actually match the real receipt for the pizza and the Coke, and the staff signed off to the fact that they'd received food, and the responsible manager then actually took a bus and submitted the expense receipt for taxi fares, which was legitimate. Yeah? Now, I gave this as an example at the Scrum Alliance conference in Berlin either last year or the year before, I can't remember which now. 3 people from IBM ran up to me afterwards and said, we're still doing that, did you invent it? And this is 17 years later. If you go into any modern organization, you will find a huge amount of energy goes into working around the rules, not making the rules happen. Yeah? And you actually see it with SAP implementations. Anybody implemented SAP? Anybody tried to pay a small supplier after you've done it? Yeah, it's actually impossible, because it's designed for the middle of a normal distribution. Yeah, so I mean, I know 3 companies who did this and then had to employ firms to employ small contractors who charge 40% overhead because they could, and you can see where the inefficiencies start to build in, all right? These very structured, ordered approaches appear beautiful in design, but actually force people into deviant behavior to get them work despite themselves. And I actually think the ERP systems are a real danger at the moment, because the time it takes to change them is actually now longer than the normal change time in market life cycles. Yeah, and that's actually quite scary when you look at it. There's a whole body of stuff we need to do on software architecture here. Okay, so you get the point about order. There's nothing wrong with order, yeah, provided you realize it only works under conditions where people will buy into and accept high levels of constraint, and it requires a lot of investment and time. You know, the training doctors and nurses go to so that operating theatre system works is years, and it's actually many years in development as well. You can't just achieve it overnight. Yeah? Chaotic systems, I'm using chaos in the sense of something which has no containers and no coupling. Yeah? Which is a kind of like, it's not randomness per se, but nothing is contained, nothing is coupled. Which actually means if you fall into it accidentally, which is what happens if you over-constrain a system, everything just suddenly breaks. It's a crisis. But if you can create it deliberately, which ironically means you have to contain it, so chaos has a container, but then no connections within it, that's brilliant for innovation, but it's also the basic principle behind what I just talked about in terms of distributed decision support. Because everybody is unconnected with everybody else. It is assessing the data in real time. You can trust the results. A famous case on this is the US Scorpion, I think, which grounded off the coast of Portugal in the 1960s, a submarine. It didn't sink. I was corrected on that by an admiral in Norfolk Navy base. He pointed out submarines are meant to sink. And I learned from that, if anybody has 3 stars on their shoulder, let them humiliate you in the first 3 minutes and it's out of the system and they might listen to you thereafter. It's good general advice for executives, full stop that, by the way. So anyway, if it grounded, they gave partial data, and actually this is really important, they gave partial data to groups of people around the world, experts in ocean currents. Nova Scotia fishermen were one of the groups, interestingly. Right? Asked them all to estimate where it was. None of them got it right, but a probability distribution of all of the estimates was 500 meters away from the actual submarine. Yeah, so you can see what we're now starting to do on distributed decision support is create that capability, but that means you've got to keep everything separate, because if people see what other people have done, they game the system. Yeah, crowdsourcing is not an example of this. That's the tyranny of herds, yeah, rather than the wisdom of crowds. Yeah, in terms of the way it works. So chaos has value. And then complex systems are ones where, to be quite honest, the containers, there may be some type of container, but it will be highly permeable or elastic. And there will be some types of connectivity, but the connectivity will be loose. I've created a new concept of constraint called a dark constraint, which is actually a reference to dark energy or dark matter. So it says we can see evidence that there's a constraint, but we don't know what it is. And that's actually very common. Yeah? So that's kind of like a complex system. Some things appear to be connected, but the connections are loose. The connections form and reform. They mutate very quickly. The containers may change. Some things may get through them. Yeah? So they're inherently uncertain. Yeah? The key thing to understand about a complex adaptive system is that it's dispositional, it's not causal. That means I can't say if I do X, it will produce Y result. Yeah? All I can say is at the moment the system is disposed to evolve in this direction and it's not disposed to evolve in this. Yeah? And that's kind of like you start to think about the implications of this. Yeah? You haven't got linear causality, you've got dispositionality, and scarily you've also got propensities. So those are features of the system which appear to produce stable, repeatable outcomes, but you don't know why they happen. So it's rather like being on a roulette wheel and it keeps coming up red, and therefore you assume it will carry on keeping up red. Yeah, and actually that's actually quite dangerous. And we see this pattern very commonly with case-based approaches. Yeah? Remember about Hawthorne Effect, etc., as it comes through. So complexity requires us to manage in a different way. Now that's actually where software can help, but at the moment it doesn't because we use linear approaches. Yeah? Scrum, from my perspective, is a technique to shift complex things into complicated. Yeah, it's not a complex technique, it's actually a way of taking things which are, they're kind of like quasi-formed. You've got a user executive who's already said that what they want. Yeah, so the thing is partly formed, and now you're going to go through a short-term linear iteration to make sure you've got it right. The huge power of Scrum is it moves things into complicated order so that they can be replicated and moved into production software. Yeah? And it deals with the boundary transition, which is really very important. Yeah? So big tick in the box. Yeah? Our trouble is it's still a linear process. So we're now working on a whole range of what I call pre-Scrum techniques. So let me give you a couple of examples. Many years ago, a group of us created a thing called the DSDM consortium. Anybody heard of DSDM? Early stage Agile. That was formed by Ed from Cambridge Scientific, myself from Data Sciences, and my equivalent in Logica. We actually couldn't sell RAD-JAD because it was too novel. So we thought if we form an international consortium and create standards, we'll be able to sell it, and if we actually are the authors of it, we'll get the early market advantage. And that worked. Notice 3 competitors did it together. It wasn't one of us choosing to try and impose it. Yeah, and that's what made it work. Now, one of the things I created for that, and Tony handled the operational side, but I indulged myself. By then I was meant to be strategy, but I went back into software design because it's still fun, all right? You don't want to get away from it. One of the techniques we did was based on the biological principle of mutation. So we'd actually have a RAD team, so we'd have prototypers working with users, and it was ambiguous. At the end of it, we'd have a rough prototype. We'd then hand it on to another software team on an 8-hour time difference, and they wouldn't have access to the original user requirement. They were just told to improve what they got. And at the end of that, they'd hand it on to another team on another 8-hour time difference. Then it would come back to the original team the next day. Every time we did it, the user said, God, we wouldn't have thought of that. That's brilliant. Yeah? And what we're actually doing, if you think about it, under conditions of stress, mutation increases in all biological systems. We're deliberately creating a mutated environment so that novelty emerges rather than the previous pattern. The stuff we're about to do on software requirements capture, and say if anybody's interested in this, we'll announce it shortly, is to get a sample of the users to continuously record their day-to-day frustrations, opportunities. Why doesn't the software do this? I've got a friend who's got something which does that. You know, take a screenshot. Why does it do this? Yeah, those continuous micro-observations. Yeah? And again, this comes back to the counter-terrorism work, and I'll show you this in a second. This is the high abstraction metadata. They then interpret into metadata. And then from that, we can actually draw dispositional landscapes. This is one example of one. Yeah? We can draw dispositional landscapes, yeah, which actually show where we've got dominant and patterns and weak patterns. So at this point, there's a simple bit of mathematics. With a certain cluster density of frustration, you're now automatically authorized to spend $5,000 on a pair programming team to spend 3 days seeing if you could do something to match that need. Yeah? Now you think about that, that's starting to change the way the game is played. Because you're now actually giving software to people to deal with unarticulated needs. Because users don't know enough about what technology can do to ask for it. And that means you've got this thing of that them asking for things or you trying to sell them things. This is a co-evolutionary approach. And of course, by leaving it in place, you can measure the impact of your software when you launch it. Right, now with this, we're going to have to relook at object-based architectures because from my point of view, applications in the future are emergent properties of the interaction of people and software objects within object-based architectures. You're not going to design applications in the future, applications will emerge. Which is why I'm not wild about the manufacturing metaphors which dominate Agile. We need to start to think about ecological metaphors. So Kanban is a great technique for order. It's a crap technique for complexity. Yeah? Because you can't reduce a complex system to a series of post-it notes working between lines you've drawn on your office wall. Yeah? We're actually playing with these things as new forms of visual representation of progress into conditions of complexity. Yeah? The other thing these do, by the way, this is actually an attitudinal map, and it's the same technology. Just to give you an idea on this, the vertical dimension on this is rule compliance, and the horizontal dimension is job completion. Now, this is from a real project with one of the world's largest manufacturing companies. Yeah? So as you can see, we've got an interesting thing. We've got a group of people who are following the rules and getting the job done. That's desirable at the top right. The trouble is when you click on that, you discover it's nuclear weapons testing. And that creates a context in which you are going to follow the rules and get the job right, or you won't get a chance to do it again, all right? It's, you know, it has this sort of strategic focus. You've got a group of people who are getting the job done by ignoring the rules, and another group of people who've just given up. They're doing what they need to do to survive. Yeah? Now, scarily, we're seeing that pattern in hospitals with nurses' records. We're seeing it in software development teams. Yeah, you know, it's kind of like we're creating these inauthentic spaces. Now, if I want to change that, and this is probably one of the most important things I'm going to say tonight, yeah? To everybody in software keeps telling me, you see all these books. I mean, Management 3.0 is one of the worst examples of it, all right? Which talk about how lovely things would be if only everybody was this sort of wonderful person. You all know these things? Yeah? I call them New Age fluffy bunny techniques, all right? It's kind of like, wouldn't life be wonderful if everybody was perfect and collaborative and open? And well, that's kind of like a cute idea. I buy it, all right? It just ain't going to happen, all right? It might sell some books and it might make you feel popular, but it's not going to work. Yeah? The reality is to shift things to the top right, and that is a step too far. Yeah? And what everybody is at the moment is they try and yank people towards a desirable future state. What they don't do is say, where are things and what can we do to change? So as you can see here, the red arrows are pointing to a small cluster of observations. That's called an adjacent possible. Yeah, which is a very good name for it, which means we can shift in that direction. And the way we work on it, we literally click on that part of the screen and we see the observations which produce that pattern. And we say, what can we do tomorrow to create more like this and fewer like that? Yeah? Absolutely no statements about, you know, all this sort of stuff about open, honesty, all those sort of value statements. You don't do any of that because that just produces a cobra effect. If you write your values down, you just lost them. Because all that will happen is people will parrot those platitudes back to you. More like this, fewer like that is key. Then you have a simple two-stage. What does a dispositional state like? Are there adjacent possibles? If there aren't, any money you spend on trying to change things will be wasted. You first of all have to create a possible or change the dispositional state, and only when it's right do you start to nudge it in the right direction. Now, this is actually really important for cultural management, cultural change, but it's also critical for user adoption. Right? Because also, remember I talked about the you don't see the gorilla because you're not expecting to see it? Okay, what happens when you announce to your user community that there's a new system coming? What are the patterns through which they filter that announcement? The patterns of continuous, successful implementation of systems which have produced major benefit, or the pattern of systems which have failed or have been late or haven't done what they wanted? Which one is it? It's the latter, isn't it? Yeah? Even if it's unfair, because we remember failure more than we remember success. So actually, by announcing a change program, you doom it to success, to failure a priori, because you create false expectations. On the other hand, if you just start to change things in a small way, what can we do tomorrow to create more like this, fewer like that? Life is actually a lot easier. Yeah? Okay, I'll just run through high abstraction metadata, and then I'm going to sort of wrap this up a bit. I'm just trying to get some points across. And also trying to get the point that if you start to understand the theory, practice becomes a lot simpler. Yeah? Because you don't have to study things, kind of like, well, you know the theory, therefore you can apply it. Yeah? That's kind of like a scientific approach. The other thing which is important to realize, and this will upset anybody who's heavily into big data or data analytics, what can be written down is about 5% of what we know. Yeah, to take Polanyi's original statement, we always know more than we can say, I added to that, and we all can always say more than we can write down. Yeah, the process of going from my brain to my hands to paper is a process of loss. Sorry, to mouth to hands. Yeah? So actually anything which relies on anything which is written is working on 4 or 5% of what you need to have access to. Right? That has big implications. Yeah? I mean, the Internet of Things has actually been very good for us, because what we do with SenseMaker is we create human sensor networks to overlay the machine sensors. Because we're saying human interpretation is as important as machine interpretation, and it's different. Okay? So, it's important to realize two things on this. Anybody read Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow? Okay, it's a really good book, great examples. It's just a huge pity he didn't walk across the corridor to his cognitive neuroscience colleagues 20 years before he started the research. Because we already knew about it. It's called novelty receptive autonomic processing. Right? But I'll use the popular language because that's the book which sold. Right? What you actually want to do, if people are thinking fast, they're just automatically going with the flow. They're not thinking deeply. Yeah? What you actually want to do, if you want to ask people questions or understand where they are, you have to trigger that switch to autonomic processing, which means you have to create cognitive stress. Unless you can create a cognitive load, people will go with a superficial response. Yeah, you have to make it difficult, impossible. Yeah? The other thing, keep it as science, the reason for this is cave painting comes before language development in humans. It's an accident, yeah, but a beneficial accident because it means we think in abstractions, we don't think in concrete terms. Which actually, with the emphasis on STEM education, is a real problem at the moment. Because if you deprive people of art, you've actually deprived them of significant intelligence. Yeah, in evolutionary terms, the ability to move to a level of abstraction allows us to combine and recombine things in novel ways, which made us hugely resilient as a species. Yeah, that's why we invented tools, all sorts of things. Yeah? So deprive people of abstraction, you've got a problem. And the trouble is most software people go concrete. Yeah? Now, my favourite illustration of this is employee satisfaction surveys. You've all done satisfaction surveys? Yeah? We got this in IBM, all right? So it comes through and it says, does your manager consult you on a regular basis, scale of 0, not at all, 10 all the time? Sound familiar? You know exactly what answer they want. Yeah? So if you're in a good mood, you give them 10. If you're in a bad mood, you give them 0. If you're statistically literate, you make it 8 or 2 because you know they eliminate outliers, all right? But you game the system. Yeah? So I phoned up HR. I got straight through to the worldwide head of HR. I had a bad reputation by now. I'd run a 6-month controlled experiment which had proved that Myers-Briggs was significantly less effective than astrology in predicting team behavior. And they were quite upset about that. They suppressed the paper and threatened to fire me, but Lou Gerstner suggested they did go, because he was quite looking forward to what happened when it came out in court, at which point they withdrew. Right? So I got straight through, and I said, how am I meant to answer this? I've got 3 managers, 5 people I take business direction from. I mean, that's the nature of modern organizations, all right? Sometimes they consult me, sometimes they don't, and sometimes they should, and sometimes they shouldn't. And I said, how am I meant to answer it? And she said, average your experience over the year and stop causing trouble, and slammed the phone down, which was a mistake. We then ran another controlled experiment in which we ended up with 1/3 of IBM Global Services filling out their employee satisfaction forms based on an algorithm we generated, and we did controlled experiments to see if we could modify the behavior of HR by modifying their input feed. Right? Yeah. Never upset bright techies with access to distributed networks. It's a scary phenomenon. Right? We take a different approach. We go to, say, 10% of the workforce every week, and we say, what story would you tell your best friend if they were offered a job in your workplace? And then we ask them to place it on a series of triangles. This is the method we developed and patented. So one of the triangles, for example, would say the manager's behavior was altruistic, assertive, analytical. And you see what's happening there, 3 positive qualities. You don't know what the right answer is. Therefore, and it's a high level of abstraction, so it generates novelty receptive. And you scroll over an iPad, for example, with 6 triangles, and you can see people thinking about it and going back and modifying things until they're comfortable with the distribution pattern. And of course, then I've got quant data. And I've got those landscape maps, so I've got the real-time feedback loops. And that's how we do user requirements capture. That's the method we developed over 10 years for the US government and the Singapore government to actually identify weak signals. Because you can't afford for people to evaluate things explicitly, you need to describe them implicitly. Now, I'll repeat, that's important. If people actually evaluate things explicitly, prejudice fits in. If they describe things implicitly, you get better data and better openness. And another illustration of that, one of the projects I'm proud of, we got young girls who've been subject to genital mutilation and rape in 2 African countries. And they're acting as distributed or field ethnographers to people at risk from their own communities who they identify, gathering their stories and helping them self-interpret their own narratives. Yeah. Now, it also means that they can sit down in their village and look at the landscapes and say, what can we do to create more like this, fewer like that? So it's an immediate fast feedback loop. It also turns out to be very therapeutic to help other people who might be at risk of your trauma rather than be counselled. It's a more effective intervention technique. But we've taken that data, which is descriptive, we've given it to experts in Washington, The Hague, and London and asked them to interpret it. And they actually evaluate it and have very narrow distribution patterns. So you look at the landscapes from the girls, there are multiple intervention points. You look at the landscapes from the experts, there's 1 or 2. Now, exactly the same thing happens with software developers. Yeah, you need users to describe, you tend to evaluate. The longer you can hold things at a descriptive level, the more you don't miss weak signals, the more open things are. So you can see where this sort of stuff is coming from. Yeah? If you want it, that's kind of like data on that, but I'm going to skip over it. Yeah? Okay, so this is an example of that. This is from decision mapping. This is also, by the way, a good way of getting... I don't know if you've seen it. It's something I developed about 30 years ago when I was in decision support systems. I gave up believing that executives knew what went on in the company. With the early stages BPR, and I set up a BPR business in an SAP implementation consultancy. I still have the memo from the managing director saying, why am I wasting money on something which has no future? I've got it with the one about why you're wasting money on roll-up and OLAP tools and why have you chosen Microsoft Windows over OS2. There's a sort of pattern here, right, if you think about it. Right? One of the things we developed was actually capturing people's decisions on a continuous basis and the information flow on those decisions, and then contrasting that with the process map. And they never, ever corresponded. The process map was how people thought things were working. The bottom-up decision information flow map shows something different. So this is a variation. This is where every time people make a decision, they record the decision, they record the information flow, then they self-interpret. And again, you can see the interpretation here. The decision was made intuitively, logically, or based on principles. It actually shows a distribution pattern after the event. So you can see culturally this company is very analytical. Yeah, it's got some principle base, but I would be slightly worried about ethics, and God help them in the crisis because it got very little intuitive capability. Yeah? Now you see them more like this, fewer like that. Yeah? Anybody knows Gaping Void? Okay. Have you never seen Gaping Void cartoons? Okay, have a look, they're brilliant. He draws them on the back of a business card when he's feeling angry. Well, one of the things we're about to do is to present a company. You choose one of Hugh's cartoons, so 20 or 30 cartoons. You choose one which represents the culture of your company. You write a small narrative about why it represents it, and you index it like this. And that allows us to produce a cultural map, which is far more powerful than those very structured questionnaires. Yeah? But then also, we're about to start to use that for recruitment. So actually, if you want to join this company, you go onto the website, you choose a cartoon which represents the sort of people you'd like to work with, you index it, we match it. If we want to continue the same culture, we match. If we want to disrupt it, we overlap, and so on. Again, we're moving this high level of abstraction in terms of the way things work. And then, of course, you saw one map. What this actually allows us to do is to have multiple maps. So I just showed you earlier on the attitudinal map from the manufacturing company. That was the board level one. That's actually one for each factory. This is called fractal representation. Each factory is different. Traditionally, I would have run an average program across the whole company, which would have upset some people. Here, each factory can ask the question in a different way, which kind of illustrates the patterns on that. Final couple of things just to get across which are critical. Exaptation. This is a biological phenomenon. Just to depress you about this, I lecture in Dallas every year, and I was working with one of the Ebola management teams. All right? Now this is an Ebola management team. All right? Ebola is a really serious problem at the moment. If you don't know it, it's a parasite which is now becoming a symbiote. It's a very dangerous stage, because the parasite learns not to kill all its hosts and creates dependency, so it goes further. And I was told I couldn't use this slide because evolution is a controversial theory. Yeah, and that's an Ebola management team, all right? I say this is getting scary, right? Exaptation is a dinosaur's feathers evolve over time for warmth or sexual display. You can see it in the fossil record. It's a linear process. Yeah? And then a species of dinosaur emerges which has lots of feathers, which is arboreal, and you can see that sense it's colder at the top of trees than it is at the bottom. And of course, because they're arboreal, they start to fall from trees, and because they've got lots of feathers, they glide. And that's how flight happens. And the conditions of stress, a trait which evolved for one function, doesn't adapt, it exapts for something completely different. And this has been huge in evolutionary theory because things happen too quickly. The creationists use it as an argument. We now know actually things develop for one purpose. So limb-like structures developed in the ocean before fish got stranded. It's not that fins became limbs. And then what I love is I forgot what it's called, the cerebellum at the base of your brain. Evolved in the higher apes to manipulate muscles in fingers so you could pick seeds from seed pods. It exapts to manage grammar in human language. Yeah, the huge sophistication of human language couldn't happen in a linear way. Yeah? Now, if you don't think this is relevant, go back to 1945, where a Raytheon engineer notices that a chocolate bar melts in their pocket while they're maintaining the magneto of a radar machine, and we get microwave ovens. Apple are masters of exaptation. If you look at Apple, they find things that people have developed for one purpose and they repurpose them, which means they can move forward much faster. They did it with the aluminium casing. There's lots of stuff they did on that. Yeah? Exaptation is one of the most powerful forms of innovation. So that's what we're now doing with user requirements capture. I can get user requirements, I can get software capability, I can have them interpreted at a high level of abstraction, I can throw the databases together, and I can create clusters and say, why are these linked? So rather than rely on somebody happening to notice something, I can present things which need to be noticed for people to decide to make decisions. And that's actually something we've done on major marketing campaigns to actually associate existing technologies with completely novel needs. Again, you start to see the science-based approach coming through here. Yeah? So part of what I talked about is to allow that. But then we have a couple of other things we need to be aware of. And sorry, I'm the Star Trek generation, right? I did my maths and physics homework to the first Star Trek, right? You probably all know this case, all right? How many people know this one? Yeah, this is a famous one where a simulation is set up in which people can't succeed. Yeah, and Kirk realizes this, so he cheats. Yeah? Okay? Say that I can never pronounce it, the Kobayashi Maru. Now, the interesting thing about this, and the reason I'm putting it up here, is that failure teaches us more than success. We remember failure, we don't remember success. Worst practice systems have more learning capability than best practice systems. If you want to create direction for cultural change, you define where you don't want to go, but you don't define where you do want to go. But if you define where you do want to go, everybody knows the purpose and they can game it. And if you think about it, it's how we manage children. Do you tell your children stories about how, Janet and John stayed at home and did what Mummy said and watched the television and they were safe? You don't do that, do you? It's Janet and John went into the woods without Mummy and Daddy's permission and met an evil witch and they almost died. But because we want them to sleep at night, we have a happy ending. But it's left right till the end, all right, just to make the point. Yeah? And physically, we remember failure, we don't remember success. Yeah? And it's actually important in cultural change, but it's also important in learning. Yeah? And this is kind of like one of the key knowledge management issues. You're going to far greater improve software testing if you keep a record of failure than if you keep a record of success. Because avoidance of failure is a more successful strategy than imitation of success. Yeah? And if you have fragmented micro failures, it's not personal. Again, it comes back to that small continuous capture mechanism. And then finally, this is from the first series of Star Trek. This is the Horta. I always liked the Horta. Yeah? They were a silicon-based life form. They thought they were rocks, so the miners kept breaking them up. But they were actually a life form. It was quite good the way they killed human beings, all right? It was the red shirts were dying in large numbers, which is the Star Trek tradition, right? Famously satirized in one good film, all right? And that's Spock trying to do a mind meld with it, and it's too different. Now, the point I'm trying to make here is that human carbon-based intelligence is not the same thing as computer silicon-based intelligence. It's radically different. Yeah? And at the moment, every time we do software design, we assume that human beings make decisions the way that computers make decisions, and they don't. So we need to start to rethink this, because this is a sort of emergent property. The scary thing for everybody in IT is the one group of human beings who actually do make decisions pretty like computers are people with deep autism. And actually Asperger's syndrome, which is a mild form of autism, dominates IT departments and economics departments, because it's an advantage, like dyslexia is linked with innovation. Don't take that as negative. Asperger's syndrome makes you a better coder. Yeah, but it also means you won't see things the way that users see it, because if you've got dyslexia, which is very dominant in marketing, I'm partially dyslexic. I was lucky when I was coding, we had 4 GLs and 3 GLs. It wasn't mathematical. Yeah? And I'd never understand why people want all the letters in the right order. What's the problem? The letters are there, for God's sake, all right? Yeah, and you know what I meant. I've missed out 5 words, but it's obvious what they should be. Please stop making a fuss about it, all right? And that drives programmers mad, all right, in terms of the way it works. And you learn actually to speak differently to different groups. Yeah? Now, I'm making this point just to say people are different. Yeah? And actually, we need to start to get technology to augment human beings rather than try and replace them. Yeah? And that's been a big problem for the last few years, which means we need an ecological metaphor, not a manufacturing metaphor, which is kind of like the final point. Okay, nobody interrupted, nobody had a fight. I can get even more provocative. Any questions? Anything anybody wants to raise? If it comes up on the screen, I can read it. All right, you can fulfill my prophecy. All right, up to you guys.
I may as well just give you the screen then. That way you can ask it directly. But we'll start with the first one. Remember, you can write on this. We've also got a microphone up the back if we need to give it to you there. So for the first off, Ian Otis wrote a very popular paper about why most published research findings are false. You're probably aware of it. How do you prove to yourself that a new idea is something worth integrating into your work?
You go to natural science, you don't go to social science. Yeah, I'm quite serious, because social science is entirely case-based, and it's deeply problematic, all right? So the way we approach it is we go to cognitive neuroscience, we go to system science, but also I go to multiple academics from multiple backgrounds, and I talk with them as well as reading the papers. Yeah? And we have got a level of certainty there that you can apply. Yeah? But for God's sake, anything which says, I've studied these 10 companies and this is what they did, so do that, that's where it goes badly wrong. Okay? It's a confusion of correlation with causation, which is actually, you know about this one? Okay, well, if you want Australia to have more Nobel Prizes, increase chocolate consumption. Chocolate consumption by nation directly correlates with number of Nobel Prizes, all right? Now, think about all the popular management books you've seen. They say all these companies do this, you'll have the same result. Bad science.
Seems fair. On a similar sort of notice, there's a lot of talk about adding arts to STEM courses throughout schooling. What would this look like in a modern engineering team? If you want, I can give you the question. Thank you.
I think several things. First of all, well, there's lots of things you can do. I mean, we need to be encouraging kids to do things like read poetry. I mean, you need to start early on. When I was at school, we had to learn a poem every week by heart. Yeah, we complained about that, but actually that increases your intelligence and your ability to handle abstractions. Mary Midgley's done some work on this. If you look at most major theoretical physics, they actually do a lot of poetry. They read a lot of poetry. Yeah, but it's abstraction. So we need to make people more general. Now, I'll give an illustration. We're just setting up a new master's program at Bangor, which is not designed to compete with the MBA, because if it did, we'd have had to consult the business school, and we haven't, all right? So it's not designed to compete with the MBA. But what we're doing is we're taking the conversion courses the university has. So if you want to do physics, but you didn't do it at school, but you got mathematics, there's like conversion course. So over 3 years part-time, you'll do the conversion courses for the sciences and the humanities. Yeah, so you're going to do a bit of anthropology, a bit of biology, a bit of physics, a bit of chemistry, but and then that's 30% of the mark. 70% of the mark is applying that to an actual case. And then in parallel, there'll be a workbook you keep which is signed off by more experienced people. That's a medieval model of apprenticeship. Right? And what we're doing there is creating a generation of generalists. Yeah, and that's what we need. Not everybody has to do this, but you've got to have people who are generalists, and a collection of specialists is not the same thing. Yeah? But for God's sake, don't do New Age fluffy bunny stuff. It's like actors believe if the world would be better if everybody were made actors, so they come and force people to do improv to their perpetual embarrassment, right? And then you get graphic artists who think the world would be a better place if everybody was a graphic artist, so they force people to draw when they're incapable of it, right? It's more important to, I mean, we know that physical environments matter, right? You know about epigenetics? Yeah, if you don't know, epigenetics is actually really scary. If you give bright mice the children of dumb mice to bring up, the children of the dumb mice are bright. Yeah? We now know that culture inherits. Yeah? We also know that there are chemical changes to your RNA based on the language you speak during your own lifespan. There's a biological change based on the sophistication of your language. So the argument now is the physical environment, creating an aesthetic environment, is as important as anything else. The sort of Dilbert cubicle campaign will actually reduce your intelligence and reduce the capability of your workforce.
On the triangle we showed before, they had the things about being intuitive, analytical, or based on principles. What would be the ideal distribution in that sort of circumstance?
Over the whole thing evenly. I mean, that's what you're trying to do. You're saying we need balance. And you're trying to move away from this concept that there's an ideal form of a leader. There isn't. I mean, Steve Denning, if anybody's read his book on leadership, he's struggling to accommodate Steve Jobs. Right? Now, I met Steve Jobs once, all right, and he swore at me and threw a pile of books, and I treasure the bruise, all right? I'm quite honoured to have been hurt by Steve Jobs, all right? But he was completely different from Lou Gerstner I work with, all right? There isn't a model of leadership, except possibly they're authentic to something which you don't understand. Yeah? So it's kind of like you need to get away from that, right? And again, it's this sort of collective capability variety. So the whole point about the triads is you should have all the skills present in your leadership group as a whole. Not all your leaders should have the same characteristic. This is one of the big mistakes. So anybody done 360 feedback? Yeah. We actually set up another website for this on IBM because they had all these rules. If you actually didn't have somebody in the third quartile response, then your results wouldn't be accepted. So we actually had people volunteering to be the third quartile responder, right? It was a sort of informal network. If you haven't learned how to gain 360 yet, you don't deserve to survive in a modern corporate. Yeah? We take a different view, all right? So you nominate any number of people. In fact, this is about to be launched for Scrum Agile coaches, if people want this. The person you're coaching, they nominate any number of people who every time they interact with them make a note of the interaction and interpret it onto 6 triangles which have only positive labels, so they can't, it's descriptive positive, not evaluative negative. Then you as a leader, in real time, on your iPad, you can see I'm all analytical, I'm not altruistic. What can I, and that may be okay. You might say, well actually, what we've been doing for the last 6 months, that's right. If it's not, what can I do tomorrow to create more like this, feel like that? And again, it's that real-time feedback and the high abstraction principle.
Slightly related to that, you talked about education and that sort of thing. Are you seeing a trend in education that's something to worry about?
Yeah. Big time. I mean, my kids, all right, and they're bright. I mean, Alan has won the university prize for the best master's thesis in anthropology, right? He got a master's in chemistry and has decided to become an auditor. I'm not quite sure why he's done that, but from a company point of view, it's okay. Alan can do the anthropology, he can keep the books, so I've got my children sorted out in that respect. But actually, their education has been module by module. So they do a module, they pass the exam, they tick it off, they move on. Yeah? And actually, they're very poor at integration. Yeah? We actually did one bunch of exams at 16 and one bunch of exams at 18 and another bunch of exams 3 years later. Yeah? And actually, we had to hold the whole of the knowledge base in our heads and deal with it. Yeah? But also, it was interesting, between 16 and 18, we had 2 years without exams, so we explored things. Yeah? My kids have never had 3 months before they've had to sit an exam, so they're entirely focused on education now has become a matter of regurgitating information rather than acquiring knowledge. Yeah? Ironically, we got rid of good things like rote learning of poems, yeah, and actually then left too much freedom on the other end, and that's deeply problematic in education at the moment, and same in company education. It's become information-centric. The other thing, if you don't know it, the way you read stuff in a book is different from the way you read it on a Kindle. I mean, all the evidence is there now. Yeah, you skim text on a screen, you don't really absorb it. Yeah, so again, we're reducing the innovative capacity of a whole generation, yeah, in terms of the way we're doing it.
I think that's absolutely incredible. I don't know about everyone else, but that's been absolutely phenomenal. Can we have another round of applause for that?